All right, welcome to the second edition of Tribal Singularity, here with Alexander Bard and a new guest, Alexander Elung, both of the intellectual deep web and both experts in transcendental emergentism. So in this conversation, we want to try to talk about this notion of transcendental emergentism and its relationship to the future of philosophy, science, and community history. And I think the point of transcendental emergentism, at least to my mind, is to escape both simplistic reductions to scientific materialism and also naive holistic interpretations of supernatural ideality or ideas. And this is, basically a dialectical process of breaking between these two, where transcendence is classically defined as something beyond or above normal human experience, and emergence is this idea of something coming into being. And so the reason why this is such an interesting topic of putting together transcendence and emergence is because usually when we think of something transcendent, we don't think about it as something emergent, something coming into being. We think about it as something eternal, something that's always been a part of being. So there's really a radicality in thinking both transcendence and emergence together. And it really hasn't been done properly in science, although many different scientists and philosophers have, played with the idea. And in the spirit and in the love of this topic of tribal singularity, we'd also like to connect it in some way to this notion of a future singularity. In other words, this collective process of transcending what we today consider to be human, something transcendent to what we today consider to be human, and something emergent, something that's not currently in being, but something that could possibly come into being. So, with that being said, I will pass it along to my lovely guests, and let's dive into this. Let's have fun with this.
I can start here by just pointing out that a favorite philosopher of yours, Cattle, is of course Slavoj Žižek, and so he's with me. And Slavoj Žižek has tried over the last 30 years to develop a philosophy that he calls dialectical materialism. And following him, another great thinker, or maybe even the American Žižek, is Adrian Johnston, who in a series of really great books has tried to develop what he calls transcendental materialism. And when Elung and I started talking about this a couple of years ago and developed these ideas together, I'm writing a book with Jan Söderqvist where I'm going to credit Elung richly because of our mutual work that we're working together on this, is that the idea here is that materialism gets stuck all the time. It's this idea of materia being fundamental. And I think that is a problem. It's just as much a problem as mind being fundamental. We get the same problem with matter being fundamental. And we look at contemporary physics today, or even contemporary subphysics, where physics is heading next, we discover that matter is not even that much of an interest any longer. Once we remove mass, we remove space-time, all kinds of weird things start happening that are very interesting. And it's very much in existence. And therefore, our ambition for Elung and me was to take transcendental materialism all the way, throw the materialism out of the door, and basically start exploring a transcendental emergentism. And for us, this has been to go back to not Deleuze, as you could expect if you're opposed to Žižek, but to go back to Alfred North Whitehead. And I'd love for Elung to introduce those who follow this conversation to maybe give us a few words on Alfred North Whitehead and his great work, because that's been a rich source for me and Elung working on the transcendental emergentism.
Yes, absolutely. Alfred North Whitehead was influenced by William James, of course, and also arguably a lot by Hegel, even though he probably never read Hegel. I think Whitehead himself said that he read a single page of Hegel and then gave up. But when you read, Whitehead, a lot of Hegel's ideas are really present there, and I think the central one is what Hegel calls dialectics and what Whitehead calls relation. On the basic idea here is that instead of materia being the fundamental building blocks of reality, relations are fundamental instead. And the way I usually explain this is that it's not the thing that relates, but the relation is the thing. a way to understand this is that if you have an object or a phenomenon, the only way that it can have any attributes like weight, endurance in time, is if it relates to something else. So weight is, of course, like relating to the gravitational field. Enduring in time requires like a sequence of time, of course. So instead of viewing the world as like primarily consisting of these blocks of materia, which was traditionally called monads, for instance, we try to conceive reality as consisting of relations. And then what Whitehead does, which is really interesting, is that he combines that with emergence, or what he calls bifurcation, which is the study of changes between what me and Bart calls different. I think Whitehead actually also calls them vectors, or at least in mathematical theory is known as vectors. But it changes between different layers of emergence. So if we take like a rose, for instance, there's the scientific object of a rose, which is the atoms it consists of, the molecular structures. There's the chemistry of a rose, but there's also the scent of a rose, which has to be smelt or experienced by a subject. So these things are not the same. They exist in different domains, and these different domains happens on different layers of complexity. And that's basically what emergentism and relationism is trying to describe, is where and how these different planes of reality interact.
Yeah, I would just add that the enemy here is not materialism per se, although that goes out the door in the process. The enemy here is reductionism. And we talk about reductionism and inverted reductionism. Reductionism in itself is that everything in our reality could be reduced to some kind of minor thing that then would have to contain absolutely everything, and would have to be somehow pre-programmed to be able to contain everything. And this was original, of course, the atom among the Greeks. Now we know that the atom is not the basis for anything at all, and that is why we're interested in difference here. Because you can also do inverted reductionism, which is the other mistake. And Whitehead has often been accused of being a panpsychist, but he was very clear that he's not. Now, he was very clear that he was an emergentist. Psyche is, of course, then the opposite end of atom. Like, we know that we arrive with the psyche, and we're pretty self-obsessed as human beings, and we think that our own psyches is like, the crowning of existence would be our psyches and what they're capable of. But the point here is that by just deciding that there are differences in the world, and these differences are not necessarily higher or lower because they're prior or following anything else. They should be studied on their own. You Alexander, call them domains. I call them emergence vectors. But the emergence vectors can be studied on their own, and this is what science, of course, and philosophy should properly do. One of them is, for example, we could just start with biology. It happens to exist at least on one planet, which happens to be ours. And out of biology has come both culture and mind and all kinds of emergence vectors that be studied separately. And we can, of course, think of chemistry as following from physics, but prior to physics, there's also subphysics. And all these different emergences, there is a point in time when an emergence happens. And after that point in time, an emergence vector appears. And what apparently are the habits of a prior emergence vector becomes the laws of the new emergence vector. So we can also discuss things like laws and habits and discuss them finally the way pragmatism did before. And we can explain, for example, why the universe exists as it does and why it's complex the way it is. But we don't have to get stuck in these ideas that it has to be in any way determined or pre-programmed. So, right. Yeah. So, Carol, for you, I think what's interesting here is the funny thing here is that I think Slavoj Žižek, when he wrote his brilliant book, Less Than Nothing, which you made a fantastic series about on YouTube that everybody should study, by the way. But if you go to Catalyst Žižek lectures there, you will discover that Žižek has probably not read Whitehead. And the irony here is that Hegel and Whitehead are perfectly compatible with one another because they work with dialectics all the time in relations.
It does seem, well, first, let me thank you guys both for giving a very clear and very concise definition of transcendental, or at least I feel like we're at the level of emergentism. We should go a little bit more into the transcendent dimension of it in the next sort of round of summary, but just sort of, it seems to me like the signifier emergentism is core here in situating it either against or along in some way with what you were saying, Bard, with, Zizek developing the notion of dialectical materialism. From what I've heard, both Zizek and sort of other philosophers of dialectical materialism are not necessarily clinging to this notion of chunks or bits of matter, like the universe made out of atoms, or, like the reductionist view of the individual psyche. On the level of physics, you have these individual atoms, chunks of matter. On the level of psychology, you have, individual mind. And as you said, Bard, if Nietzsche said God is dead, at least for your philosophy, you're saying the individual is dead. So it's this getting out of, monistic thinking, these isolated monads, these isolated atoms. And as you already said, Elung, that to sort of invert the little chunks of matter, to invert the little bits of matter, and we could do that with the mind as well, to invert the way we think about the mind and instead think about them only having an existence based on relations. And the immediate connection I think of when I think about Hegel's philosophy, which, unlike Whitehead, I've, labored through it very intensively and with a lot of difficulty, is that really he takes the Cartesian cogito and he makes it fully social. He makes it fully historical. It's no longer that you can think of the cogito or the res cogitant as having substance independent of relations. We're always, in other words, for Hegel, there's always the other. There's always this, you're always in a web of others. And like you eloquently said, Elung, things get their substance from relation and not the other way around. And that an entire science can be developed through these emergence vectors. I think that, when you're describing this potential science in a Whiteheadian way, I mean, for me, on my first reflection on it, I do see many similarities with Deleuze's project as well. Like that there are synthesis, like that Deleuze imagined a similar type of science, that he saw his philosophy as not against science, but trying to think about the preconceptual scaffolding that could be the foundation for a new science. So you might want to reflect on that a little bit, or also maybe try to connect what you were saying with emergentism with its relationship to transcendentalism. Where is the transcendent in this emergentist philosophy? This would be my first question.
Okay, I would like to add that when it comes to Hegel, the way Hegel does it in contemporary language is that he adds project to subject and object. He says subject and object is not a stale relationship the way Kant described it, but actually product is there. And product is actually what happens between subjects. So when subjects are going to do something with the object itself, that's when they really come alive. So we have a sort of a living relationalism all throughout Hegel all the time. And this is where Hegel has been widely misunderstood, but that's how we should read Hegel. I would add here that the transcendental aspect of this is the fact that these different emergence vectors that we know about do affect one another. And this is very important here, since this is metaphysics. It's not a precondition that we live in a monist universe. We just happen to live in one. And Elung here cleverly came up with the idea of neutral monism, meaning that none of the emergence vectors is prior to any of the others. There's no hierarchy between them. They just happen to exist. They happen to operate in certain ways. But even if each emergence vector is irreducible to the one they came out of, so each emergence, that's why it's an emergence. It's irreducible to whatever existed before it. It has a completely different existence of its own that really cannot be explained through the previous emergence. It has to be understood on its own. That's our precondition for actually describing an emergence. So emergences themselves are few and far in between, but they're very, very useful when you're going to look at the world in different ways. But they all affect one another. I give you a perfect example of how actually this interaction occurs. For example, we talk about culture as being an emergence. It's obviously human beings interacting with the world, and because they interact with the world, it's no longer nature, but it has a cultural quality because it is a conscious mind, or at least a subconscious mind, that interacted with the world. So we could talk about what we then produce, for example, technology. We could talk about it as something entirely different than nature itself. It operates in a different manner. It motivates to not be reduced to nature. So therefore, culture is irreducible to nature. But culture also comes out of mind. And here's when it gets very complex. It's precisely the relation between mind and nature that enables culture to come out of both. So it's not like there's an emergence and there's a vector, like here's first physics, and out of physics, boom, comes suddenly chemistry, and boom, out of chemistry comes biology, because actually these emergences can occur anywhere, always through interactions. And whenever an emergence occurs in history, it will have been affected by all the other emergence vectors that are in existence. And this is what we call neutral monism. And I think this is when we move towards what we call transcendence. Because to even think that, for example, a new emergence could happen. Quentin Melasou, for example, is a French philosopher, thought a lot about this. He spent a lot of time thinking, what is it? What could that be called? When he calls it God, because there's no better word for that. But if there would be an emergence that would come out of mind or come out of culture and mind collaboration that wouldn't be reducible to mind or culture, this is what we call transcendent here. To me, that's where I bring the word, the prefix transcendence into the picture.
For me, I think I agree with Bart, of course. I think there are two ways that I think about the transcendental aspect of emergentism. And the first one is that we have to transcend idealism. So we like, and so even when you're talking about transcendental materialism, which again is based on Hegel, in some sense, we are transcending our own sense faculty, our own perception of phenomena, into understanding what lies beyond that. That's the one aspect. The other aspect is that if we have, let's say, if we have materialism, the big problem of materialism is how does new attributes arise? So, like, if everything is based on matter, how does something come into being which is subjective, because we don't conceive matter as being subjective. So the monist interpretation, and I would say that I'm not necessarily calling myself a monist anymore, although if I were one, I would call myself a neutral monist. But the relationalist solution is that everything is based on relations, and then suddenly a new emergence happens. The new emergence has to transcend the old vector. And that's the other way to understand transcendental in this way. So, like, you have, it's not like materialism is out the window. Materialism is a very good way of dealing with matter. But when we are not dealing with matter, when we're dealing with poems, we wouldn't necessarily say, how do we study the molecular structure of the symbol of the rose? That wouldn't make sense. So that's not something we can investigate from a materialist perspective. Or, like, if we take physicalism, where in the universe does my idea of a three-headed monkey exist? I mean, like, one aspect would you could reduce it and say, well, it's brain chemistry, but like the idea cannot really be reduced to a brain state. So that's why we're also using the concept transcendence in that context.
And we're also so radical when we do this that relationalism itself is not a requirement for any emergence vector. I would say that I'm a relationalist because anything that makes sense should better be described as relations that result in relata rather than described as objects that are sort of monadic and swimming around on their own. But I also think that when we started digging into this, for example, we started digging into physics and starting into the problems that physics try to solve. And you can study, for example, Lee Smolin and Roger Penrose, who are almost like philosophers. They're fantastic physicists, right? Then we discovered that we need to describe something we called subphysics because physics doesn't make sense any longer as one emergence vector. Obviously, there are emergences that led to physics. For example, what used to be called the Big Bang, and is increasingly looking like the Big Bounce. And it turns out that some of the ideas we had here, for example, the concept of hypertime as something that exists prior to space-time. I just said prior to space-time, meaning that it cannot be measured with the clock. But if hypertime exists prior to space-time, then the Big Bang was probably some kind of a big bounce. And if it was a big bounce, we can eliminate problems like inflation in physics, which has haunted physics for the past 40 years. And Roger Penrose is not buying into these ideas. He also says that, yeah, because if you think of a universe consisting only of photons, which probably the current universe will end up, and these photons then have no mass, and there's no mass left in the universe everywhere, the whole point with space-time disappears. And it would be like all of the universe, no matter how big it is, would just, boom, dissolve itself and start fresh from an existence that has a time and hypertime to it, but no space. And if you have hypertime prior to the big bounce, You solve a lot of the current problems of physics. But that's no longer physics. Of course, we can now, in hindsight, again, being very Hegelian, discuss the necessity of actually establishing an emergence vector prior to physics itself, and we call this subphysics. And then the question is, if subphysics is still around even after the Big Bounce, which it probably is, it's a neutrally modest universe, that means that subphysics has effects on everything. Oh my God, wait a second. We can have a realm that only exists of pure potentials without actualities, which is very Deleuzian. And that realm of pure potentials could be some kind of membranes that exist outside of space-time. They're sort of just like the Higgs field would be, for example, in physics. But when they interact with one another, when they start relations, boom, that's when you get space-time and you get physics. So physics is the origin, to me, at least in my research, for the origin of relationalism itself. And then chemistry, biology, everything else follows from that. But relationalism in itself is not required for something to exist in a very sort of virtual sense.
That's okay.
Right.
That's very interesting.
So,
yeah. Continue. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, two of the, in my view, mega problems in science have to do with where you hit an infinite regress. So, for example, we hit an infinite regress with the Big Bang. You know, like you always have people like Richard Dawkins or many different scientists say, you know, you have the problem of saying if you posit something more complex at the beginning of space and time, then you have to say where that thing came from. But then you also have the infinite regress of the mind itself, and that usually locates itself in philosophy with the Cartesian cogito. You know, is there a little man inside our head pulling the strings? You know, where is the mind? You know, like this type of thing. And when you're describing the way you're trying to introduce hypertime as this realm of pure potential, I think it's extremely interesting to explore and go into how you're conceptualizing this notion of hypertime. Because let me just toss the idea of how I understand Hegel's notion of the concept. So when I think about Hegel's notion of the concept, you know, the concept in itself is just this space of potential. It's just potentiality. And then what we call time is the becoming of the concept. You know, there's a great notion in Alexander Koyevi's book on Hegel where he just has the formula of C equals T. In other words, concept equals time. So, and then you also have this common notion in of Hegelian philosophy of, you know, the concept falling away from itself and returning back to itself. You know, so you could have this notion, you know, the Big Bang is the concept falling away from itself, and you could have like the technological singularity is the concept returning to itself or something like that. I find this way of thinking as potentially an interesting way to put philosophy into conversation with what you're introducing as hypertime. How do those ideas run around in your heads, you know?
Well, Matthias Boderwald is a young German genius, on the level with you guys at least. He proved in 2011 with an equation that if you just remove infinity, which is sloppy mathematics to begin with, because there's no infinity in reality, there are no zeros either. And if you just remove the infinity from the mathematics, you actually arrive with a big bounce and not a big bang. Oops, whoa. So it was an imploding universe that became the universe we have now. Boderwald's conclusion was that it's probably some kind of a pulse. At least then he puts the infinite regress as like, we have no idea how many pulses the universe has done over, you know, eons and eons of time. But at least the current universe has a starting point. And prior to that starting point, there was another universe there. Now, that I don't think is that likely any longer, because when Penrose heard about this, his idea was essentially that, no, wait a second. If you just consider the fact that space-time and mass are connected, and that space-time doesn't make any sense because without mass there can be no clocks, you cannot measure time, for example, then actually you get to a point where universe as ours actually dissolves itself and can get restarted. And Penrose then proved it. Elegant mathematics again, that was perfectly feasible. I find that much more interesting simply because it ties into an idea that I've been promoting for almost 30 years, which is the idea of hypertime. And the reason why hypertime is part of this is that we cannot talk about something prior to space-time without assuming that there is some kind of time there. Actually, we cannot think anything outside of time. It's just, this was Heidegger's great insight too. Time is more essential than space. And once you've accepted that the time dimension is the origin on which the space dimensions are built, and once you accept that space is completely dependent on time, time is not just change. Even if something is fixated and lasts, and a rock in space doesn't move or whatever, it's still a fucking clock measuring something going on here called the fixation itself. We cannot think beyond time. And I have not yet found a single philosopher who in any way is even tempted to think beyond time. That means we need more than space-time. We cannot talk about time if we limit ourselves to space-time. And maybe that's where the Hegelian concept is pure potential. It's actually tied to hypertime. Whereas when Hegel talks about is that he then adds to the concept space-time. And according to me and Elung here, is when we add space-time and thereby introduce physics. And space and time are a relation within space-time. It's the origin of relationalism in itself. So that is the relation that enables space to exist together with time. And in that weave the space-time is, which consists of discretions, then the potentials can turn into actualities. And those are the relations of Whitehead.
Yes, absolutely. I think another important point is perhaps that what Barth is calling hypertime is also called the implicate order by Bohm. There is, of course, some important differences. So when Bohm is talking about the implicate order, he is in fact setting up a deterministic universe. But this has been explored by many different thinkers. Whitehead calls it the non-temporal order. And I agree with Barth that it's probably wrong to consider it non-temporal, but rather it should be considered a different sort of temporality. But the point of this, like implicate order, or let's say Wheeler calls it pre-space, is that if you have time, it must be based on some laws. And those laws cannot emerge into existence with time itself. It must come from somewhere. But the problem is there is nowhere without space and time. So there isn't actually a place where these things can be located. So that's why we call it the implicate order, is the potential which allows existence itself to emerge. And like when Barth is talking about it now, he's talking about it as a physics-based phenomenon. But I would argue that this happens at every level of emergence. So when we go from subphysics or hypertime or whatever we choose to call it to physics, physics also sets up an implicate order which allows physics to transcend into chemistry. So there are these building of complexities which comes from a larger number of enduring objects, things that endure in time and space. And that's where you go from the actual event, which comes from the relation, to the probability of new things emerging. So the important thing here is the movement from actuality to probability, and probability then creates the floor for a new emergence to dance on, so to speak. So it's a gradual creative unfolding.
Yeah, that's why you and I are opposed to the idea of determinism versus indeterminism. We call it the false dialectical relationship. We talk about transdeterminism instead, because these things cannot be explained out of the old determinism versus indeterminism Abrahamic concepts. That also means that eliminates the determinism problem from Bohn's equations, because they end up with many worlds interpretations. If you've seen this series Devs, which is, on Netflix, it gets more and more absurd because it goes into many world universes and all that. It's absurd, right? It is absolutely absurd. And you end up with those absurdities when you apply determinism, right? So transdeterminism solves the problem. But then what is really useful here is to understand implicate versus explicate orders. That's exactly what happens prior to and after the emergence. This is where Elung is absolutely right. I would argue that to talk about an emergence in itself is to discuss an implicate order prior to the emergence and an explicate order following it. And it's interesting here because we come to the problem that Charles Saunders Peirce was obsessed with among the American pragmatists prior to Whitehead. And Peirce was obsessed with the idea that when we talk about the laws of nature, we're just sloppily using a metaphor from permanent settlement and law books and the way we created law 5,000 years ago, when in reality, these are just habits of nature. And some of these habits seem to get stuck after a while, and some of these habits seem to be more fluid and oscillating. And it turns out, at least Smolin agrees in physics, for example, that habits tend, when something is really close and it just happened, they tend to be very loosey, fluid, and then they get more and more fixed the bigger and more complex the system becomes. For example, decoherence turns a habit into a law. But I would argue that the great thing about discussing implicate priors and explicate afterwards, after emergences, is that we can speak of habits in the implicate order becoming laws in the explicate order. Yeah. And this can explain precisely why physics operates exactly the way it does. Because the moment physics was born, the emergence of physics, whatever was habits in the sub-physical world prior to physics became the laws of the physical existence. So that would explain why laws seem to get stuck as much as they do within certain emergence vectors once those things have happened.
And tying into I'm sorry, Cattle, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, of course, the problem with laws and thinking in terms of laws is that you can't think emergence. You can't think. The contradiction when you think of a fully lawful universe, you naturally come to this notion of an eternal universe, which is exactly what Newton presupposed. And we underestimate the degree to which our image of the universe has changed in the last, say, 150 years. I mean, it's a radically different picture. And I think philosophy is yet to catch up, but I really do like this notion of the use of the metaphor of thinking in terms of habits, because you do get a naturally more organismic-like thinking about the universe. You can think, for example, about a universe being born. You can think about a universe growing. You can think about a universe dying. You can even think about a universe reproducing. So I think these notions are extremely fun to play with, and they're devastatingly underthought in physics. In terms of thinking in this way. So it's a lot of fun. And then the other mega conceptual transformation to me is the kind of inverting on thinking about space and time. That time is more fundamental than space, and I think the intellect in particular can be, let's say, the first order of the understanding can be sort of blamed for its bias towards thinking in terms of spatial representation. The understanding loves to frame things in terms of spatial representation, and it loves to frame things in terms of presence. So you have the presence of things in space. This is the understanding loves this, but you can't then explain how this representation of space emerged. So again, you have this problem when you push this line of thinking to its extreme, you get an absurd contradiction. So I love rupturing this, and I love playing with this, and I think, of course, both of you are doing it in a fantastically interesting way. So I'm sure you have a lot more to expand on. So please do.
Well, we talk about pan-organicism and we talk about pan-dialecticism. And I'm just flabbergasted that people still talk about quantum mechanics. When everything oscillates on that level, why shouldn't it be quantum organics? It makes more sense, like you said here, Cattle, to actually, there are much richer metaphors to get out of this without going the slightest bit spooky and actually go more scientific than science itself.
Yeah, before you elaborate, Elung, and I want you to elaborate next. But just to quickly go on, play on what Bard just said. I want to throw this out because maybe both of you will appreciate this. I have done some primary literature research on quantum gravity, and in my views, the real presupposition or axiom, and this is following Lee Smolin, the real presupposition or axiom which undermines the current attempts to formulate a quantum gravity is this reliance on the absolute space-time is still there. So it's this background dependence is what he calls it. So there's this notion, and this is because the understanding loves to have the spatial representation of space-time there. So this background dependence prevents us from thinking the emergence of the new and you need to have background independence. You need to have openness and incompleteness. I think what you would talk to Elung as a implicate order following Bohm. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you.
Well, I really connected with something you said earlier, which was basically like using human concepts such as birth to associate them with like physics and so on. But I think what we should also be mindful of is that ontology is to a large part also projection of our own psyche. And that is what exactly we are trying to avoid by using transcendental emergentism, is to understand that we can't really avoid projecting ourselves into whatever we are describing, but we can understand what is common among these different vectors of emergence. So like the underlying principles, and like Irvin Laszlo, which I know you are familiar with, at least both of you actually, is trying to uncover like this underlying system which exists in all types of domains or vectors, or what we would like to call them. So in some sense, I think while it's really interesting to think of the implicate order as being prior to space-time, the implicate order is also outside space-time, in the sense that if we send, let's say, 157 people to an island, an uninhabited island, there is an implicate social structure already there before they begin to speak to each other. I mean, there are a lot already there. So when they begin to interact, then the social emerges. But there is an implicate social order there, which allows those the social sphere to emerge, if that makes sense.
The important thing is to eliminate the determinism versus indeterminism aspect of the whole thing. The way things work, actually, and we know pretty much about the universe by now, we agree that there's a closed universe within which all these different spheres and domains and vectors exist. Okay, the universe itself actually operates deterministically, locally. It operates indeterministically, locally. And that's precisely when we look at over all of the history of the universe, there are certain systems that operate deterministically, some operate indeterministically, and they can also change in between that. The starting point of the goal for a certain system can be very deterministic, but what happens in between can be indeterministic, and we look at probability, that's very much the case. But the fact that there are indeterministic periods within deterministic loops means that transdetermination is the only way to describe how reality actually operates. And this is interesting. We go to Hegel, because Hegel describes the future as contingent, but he also understands that we must understand history as a necessity. And I think that makes a lot of sense when we discuss transdeterminism. Transdeterminism is already there in Hegel. It is the foundation of understanding history as necessity, but understanding the future ahead of us as contingent. And it's contingent precisely because it's so damn complex. It has so many forces interacting with one another. The power of decoherence is so massive. This whole idea of dividing between quantum organics and eventually classical physics and try to understand the two, it just doesn't make any sense at all, because once decoherence sets in and all the different forces and all the different fields, all this universe start interacting with anything in the universe, it doesn't make sense to speak about the world's deterministic or indeterministic any longer.
No.
There are enough chances in there. There are enough little slides in one way or the other, or broken probabilities when suddenly something, for example, becomes a wave function collapse, which is, if anything, an emergence. When these things happen, it doesn't make any sense. And then we realize, who came up with the idea of the determination to begin with? But of course, it's a remnant from the universe of the creator God. It just doesn't make any sense. And the fact that people are seriously discussing that opposition and haven't thought through it dialectically and realized it's actually fake opposition, I think speaks volumes. And that's why we established transdeterminism even before we start talking about the different emergence vectors. And once we've done that, maybe I'm differently from Elung, but I'm very, very careful about discussing rules that are general for the different emergences. Because once we do that, we move back to the fucking hell of predetermination once again. I would rather say that if we know anything about any future emergence, is that it will itself be so radically different from previous emergences that we will start discussing emergence vector theory differently once it has happened. And I always make the comparison with paradigms throughout history. Once we move into a new period of history, which is the cultural equivalent of emergence vectors. Once we move into a new paradigm in history, we realize that the fact of experiencing a new paradigm means we have to rewrite the history of all previous paradigms to understand them.
I agree.
Totally.
I think that I agree that like the emergences doesn't have the same rules. That's the wrong way of conceiving of it. But I think there's an underlying system with maybe of habits, which we can analyze on all levels of emergence, and that is the way we describe the implicate order. So there is things such as negation in all emergence vectors. There is negation, there is correlation, there is identity, there is difference. Like all these things exist. So that's a way of using and understanding how the implicate order can affect different vectors which have immensely different attributes.
So how can we get a deeper understanding of this implicate order? Let me use the example. Let me jump off the example you were giving, Elung, of, even if you take a group of humans and send them to an island to build a new society, you're saying there's already an implicate order there, which in some sense constrains the possibilities of the relations between them. So, this reminds me of a conversation I had with a woman who had she was extremely sex positive, extremely free love, free sex, everything. And, she's Bard, but definitely Bard's type of woman. But basically, in our conversation, she had this idea: we're going to find donors and we're going to find land to start a totally new community, and it will be based on just a free for all of sex, and there'll just be a totally revolution in sexuality. And that she said the bodies will just the nervous systems in the bodies will just determine the fucking. And I thought, I thought there's no possible way that will work. That there will be so much fighting and there'll be so much conflict that there will be some new set of rules that emerges to regulate the way the sexuality occurs. It won't just be this chaotic free-for-all of sex. So I guess what I was saying is that there's something about the implicate order of our human beingness which would prevent the type of image that she was trying to actualize. So in some ways I was getting at, what is the implicate order? What is the space of possibilities within which we could redesign society?
Well, the implicate order is full of potentials, but the problem is that that's where negation kicks in, is that you eliminate a lot of different possibilities. And actually, when something is actualized, it means that of all the different potentials, possibilities, every one of them has been removed except one that's left. And that's the one that's actualized. So when actuality occurs, it means that negations have happened on such a massive scale that all the possible potentials have been removed except one.
Well, I think this also ties in with Bart said earlier about laws versus habits. So, I mean, if you look at certain monkey societies, they have a sexual system which is free for all. So they don't, like, their sexual hierarchies are not based on sexual selection, but by dominance of certain males, which keeps other males from getting females. So
yeah, but this wasn't. She was thinking that we would just have a free for all of sex, and there wouldn't be these guerrilla harems. I would say that it would be more likely you would have harems forming, and and guys would just, you know what I mean?
Right. The reason why I mentioned the monkeys was just to explain that their social orders are habits. So they're not laws. So like different animals have different cultures, and those result in different social interactions. And I think another discussion is when culture emerges, if that's prior to consciousness itself, or I think some interesting discussions could be had there. But what I'm getting at is that we of course have an implicate order as humans, and Bart has written to great lengths about this as like the tribe, and how the tribe and the psyche interacts. But like in line with the theme tribal singularity, there's also a possibility of new social orders emerging. But they don't necessarily just come from like ideals or trying to enact your personal ideology into the world. Like it's a slow emergence into whatever comes next.
I would say it can be
Absolutely.
quick emergence if it's a technological change. My argument is that human beings change very, very slowly, but technology can make things happen rapidly.
Let me play off that, Bard, because there's something you mentioned just a few moments ago that I want to zero in on and bring more attention to, and it's actually something that I think is, at least for me personally, a crucial element of transcendental emergentism that should be emphasized in order that it don't become an ideology, which is this self-reflective acceptance of the fact that here to quote you exactly, if we know anything about future emergence, it will be so radically different from anything else that we will start discussing emergence vector theory itself differently. So this self-reflectivity of the emergence vector theory is so crucial, because how many theories do not meta-theorize their own temporality? All theory, that this is so crucial, because so many theories don't do that. They don't meta-theorize their own temporality, and this is the mistake of the understanding, to say, oh, we're against spatial representations, but actually we're just going to make our own spatial representation, which is unconsciously also eternal.
This is the problem with Plato. This is the problem with, it's like you could think of the world as either deterministic or indeterministic, but you reserve a certain determination that you have found out, right? And that determination must be valid at all times. No, the only thing, this is where Hegel is a radical. The only thing that is valid is that you must expect that something novel can happen in the future that changes history forever, including what was necessary for you up until now will radically change. It's a precondition for understanding anything. And it's at least a lesson we learn from history. This is why, in parallel with emergence vector theory that I've developed here with Elung for the new book that I'm writing, Process and Event, that I'm writing with Sedekist, we're working on, in parallel, paradigmatics. And paradigmatics is the cultural equivalent to this. So we go into one emergence vector here, which is biology. And out of that comes mind. And then we discuss what happens with mind as human mind when it operates within all the other emergence vectors that are present on the current planet where we live. Now, it turns out that history has gone through certain dramatic events that are very similar to emergences. And these events are primarily, as far as we know now, according to where we're at now in history, it would seem that the information technological emergences here, or events, are the ones that determine how human beings think about themselves and how we interact with one another. That means that spoken language makes us different from animals. It means the written language makes us different from the spoken language people. It means that the written language people become different when they get printed language people 600 years ago. And now we're moving to interactive language, and it's an entirely different world, including a world where space has disappeared, because we can talk to anybody in the world anywhere we like at any given time through Zoom. And suddenly we're all stuck with time, because even within our own space-time, space has more or less become irrelevant. So that in itself, there's so many factors here. Do you see how complex this gets? It's like a decoherence of history. There's so many factors involved that the only thing we can do is to sit down and say, what was the last time we did something radical like this and constructed the paradigmatics of history? Oh, it turned out it was the 19th century. Why? Because it was the industrial age. And then it became the taming of physical materials, like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Stone Age, or whatever. All those ages were invented in hindsight as necessities in Hegelian process in the 19th century to understand history. And that made perfect sense. This is what we as human beings can do at best. And this is why I'm promoting a paradigmatics today, where we start where we're at right now. We start with informationalism. We start with the digital or the internet age. We start with understanding the world from how we try to come to grasp with it now. And then we reread history as a necessity in the Hegelian way. And then, of course, it is the specific paradigms between the different types of ways of we communicating that determine what it means to be human.
And building on that, I also think we could go into like psychoanalysis of ontologies to understand how they are limited like in a certain temporal space. So and this goes back to what we were talking. Sorry?
We need that.
Yeah, we need that, because this also ties into what we were talking about earlier regarding like our tendency to project ourselves and to project like our own cultural understanding and our own psychological understanding. So, I mean, I'm really interested in, so one thing we could probably start by saying is that any truth, to be able to be true, has to be limited. Because for anything to be true, it has to be a statement about something, and that requires each constituent to have an identity. But if A is A means nothing. So there must be a difference between A and what A is before it's capable of meaning. That means that A delta, as we call it in mathematics, which just means change, cannot be the full meaning of A. So that means that any truth or any theory must be limited. And the interesting question is what is it limited by? So, and you also talked about this, when you're talking about lack. So what is the theory lacking in relation to the whole? So what is symbolism lacking in relation to the whole? What is materialism lacking? And what materialism is lacking is difference.
Absolutely.
And using psychoanalysis, talking about materialism, then we understand that, well, this is a slightly neurotic way of looking at the world. And then using principles from psychoanalysis, we can start a process of individuation. So communing with other aspects of our minds. So this is also a way of like building on what you said, like overcoming our own psychological limitations in that way.
Absolutely. I just want to say, Elung, if you keep on bashing the A equals A, Ayn Rand is gonna come up from her grave and start trying to attack you. No, but
Ayn Rand should have joined the sex cult. She would have been much better off.
I totally agree with you guys, and of course I agree also with Bard's emphasis on it's really now the technological emergences are really the things that are changing our human culture. And I think it's one of the blind spots of 20th century philosophy to not take technology more seriously and leave it to the scientific materialists and the STEM people. Because, as soon as humans went to the moon, people like Heidegger and Deleuze should have been writing about it, what is these types of things require deep philosophical analysis. And today, I really think the philosophers should feel ashamed that they aren't leading the charge in interpreting things like the technological singularity. That's why I dedicated my PhD thesis to the technological singularity, was because I saw that all of the philosophers weren't talking about it, and I saw it was left into the hands of the STEM people, and I saw that they weren't philosophically capable of interpreting the meaning for human beings and consciousness and all these things. So I just think that it's time for philosophy to reclaim talking about technological emergences and the deep way in which they transform our very human beingness. And the way Bard frames the conversation in terms of speaking language, written language, printed language, and now this interactive language, these are the metasystem transitions which have really fundamentally shaped our lives, and they're going to keep happening, and they're going to retroactively change the way we think about ourselves. So maybe for the last closing out here, I would invite both of you, or ask both of you, to reflect on how do you think you would approach notions like the technological singularity from the point of view of your theories about of emergence vector theory and transcendental emergence and stuff like this. How do you think it engages these topics?
I would say that the negation here is that when we go in through the current paradigm shift, and we're stuck in it right now, and we don't understand the world, the fact that 8 billion people suddenly have a megaphone in front of them and they're all shouting at the top of their lungs and nobody's listening because they all gone hyper narcissistic out of plain desperation. We've all become sort of fundamentalist hysterics. It's just like, if you look at history, that's quite obvious, right? But nobody's discussing it. And that means that when we're stuck in this paradigm shift to realize the old doesn't work any longer, we fall back into what we regard to be timeless. But what we regard to be timeless is what I call tribal poiesis. So tribal poiesis is basically going back to the tribe. And it's not that the tribe was timeless. It's just that it lasted for a very long time. We talked about something called socio-ontology. The original tribe is called the sociont these days in data anthropology. We lived in it for about 70,000 years. It shaped every human being on the planet. We can kill racism through this theory because we're basically saying that we lived for 70,000 years in the different climatic zones, and we lived in a tribe, and we oriented ourselves according to a clan size of 157, a tribal size of 1,200. Anything larger than that is chaotic to us and very dangerous. Now, what happens now is that when the nation states fall apart and these old structures don't work and a pandemic is running amok across the planet, is it being reminded that this tribe is the only thing we trust. And if you're going to make anything larger than that, which we haven't really adapted to evolutionarily, because the paradigms have happened so quickly, we've gone through these paradigm shifts so quickly, the 4 last ones, so we're suddenly stuck with this digital realm where space has disappeared and we're all stuck on the same planet and we're tied along the timeline. And what are we going to do with that? It's just like, well, the only way to do it is to rethink all of history, rewrite all of history, discuss what is an empire, what is a nation, what are the possible larger units of social collaboration that go outside of the tribe, because otherwise we're going to kill each other. The apocalypse will be here. We weren't prepared for this. It's like nobody prepared us for digital, and the philosophers certainly didn't. They were stuck in postmodernist sort of drivel and hermeneutics most of the 20th century. So you're right, Cattle. We have to catch up quickly. And I think the process to first look at negation, then rewrite history according to what's necessary now. And only then can we slowly begin to understand what is happening in the world.
I agree a lot with Bart. One thing I would add, which is also based on Bart's version of nomadology, is that we are unable to act outside the tribe, even though the technology changes. So when we're interacting on the internet right now, we are not necessarily, we're acting as though we were talking to members of our own tribe. And this has now resulted in like greater polarization that we experienced in the world, but which would be quite normal in a tribe, because in a tribe you would like have people who were more left-leaning, more caring, and you would have people who were more interested in structure. But the problem is that when we move away from these societies of 157 people into a global society, and we are trying to have the same discussion on a global level, things run amok. So what I think is that new societies have to be created within the digital sphere, which are also based on like our new tribe, like 157 people online. So we have these discussions with each other instead of having it on a global plane where it can cause catastrophe. So we have to align ourselves into the new technology, and there will be some turbulence in the beginning, but like it's a process of adaptation, I think.
Yeah, and I'm totally pro AI. We can get AI to actually serve humanity in this sense, because when we fail as human beings to go outside of the clown size 157, AI doesn't have any borders at all. The internet protocol is already the universal law on the planet today. So the internet is there. This is what I've written about in several books, is that the internet is already there. And thankfully, the internet doesn't know borders, and it can translate from one language to 500 languages within a second. It's like a priest has arrived out of technology to try to save us, and I think we need that. I definitely need technology to save the planet. It's undoubtedly the case. Even to just communicate with foreigners and strangers, and learning how to love a stranger and not kill each other, it's going to require enormous amounts of AI. And hopefully, that's the way AI is going. If the philosophers can convince AI developers about that.
Well, I think it's very interesting and very timely for us to at least bring these topics up and try to bring together these disconnected fields, because it's so weird that at the same time we have all these radically emergent technologies like artificial intelligence and totally new life on the internet, we at the same time have absolutely a politics of tribalism, which is unreflective, unconscious, and I think part of it is bringing to our consciousness, and maybe this is really one of your main tasks here, Bart, is bringing to consciousness the fact that we are tribal, bringing to consciousness the fact that we cannot get around that. It's so, and the fact is that if you look at the political landscape today, the fact that we're tribal is obvious, and the fact that we're unconscious about that is obvious. So that's where I would see the real psychoanalytic project today, is to bring to consciousness more that we really are tribal, and no matter how advanced our technology is getting, unless we fundamentally change our nature on some deep level, we came from tribes and we feel safe in tribes, and we get our trust from tribes, and now we have to think tribal organization in a totally new technological landscape. And that's in some sense what this series is about, you could say. So I want to thank both of you for coming on. Maybe last thing, could you guys let the listeners know where they could find more of your work or get in touch with you more before we sign off?
You could just Google Alexander Bard and then check out my books on Amazon. That's all there's to it. And we're all in intellectual deep web. You can apply to the intellectual deep web. I highly recommend that if you love our conversations.
Yeah,
Elung,
you just you won't find you won't necessarily find anything regarding philosophy, but you can Google me as well. I'm a screenwriter, so I'm mostly working fiction right now. But I'm writing a book with cattle. That's the other way.
Yeah.
So maybe you'll be able to read some of my work then when that's published.
And if you apply to the intellectual deep web, you'll get to see him. So I want to thank both of you guys for coming on. I think that this was remarkably, for those who watch this and really give it their time and attention, I think that they will get a remarkably clear and concise understanding of what you guys are working on with Transcendental Emergentism, and a connection to potential future tribal singularity. So thank you guys both.